First of all, I want to thank the children's choirs and the Crossroad singers for leading us this morning. Thank you so much for your music. I have two other announcements to make. And the first one, I think the most important one, is that Susan and I have a third grandchild born on Monday. So to use Paul's words, it is necessary for me to brag. His name is Luca Alexander Segretti, born to Katie and Alex Segretti, our daughter and son-in-law, and I just happen to have a picture. Yeah. Got it? All right. And I have 100 more on my iPhone after worship. Be glad to share those with you. The second announcement is that the series that we're in is a series on the Apostle Paul, and in April we are taking a journey, and that is the Greek journeys of Paul. It is an opportunity to follow those journeys of Paul and to learn a lot more about the apostle. There's an information meeting a week from tomorrow evening about that trip. And if you're interested, please come and learn more about the trip. It'll be in room 154. There's an announcement in your bulletin about that. We are in the series on Paul, and the text we have from Paul today, the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians, is an odd text. Somebody who had read it this week said to me, "That is so strange, I have no idea what Paul is talking about." And it is a difficult text in a way because Paul seems to not know exactly what he wants to say. I don't want to brag, but I have to brag. I shouldn't brag, but I must brag. But if I'm going to brag, I'm going to brag about my weakness. But that's to keep me from bragging. I mean, it just, you wonder what in the world is going on. And what you need to understand is that Paul has some critics in the church at Corinth, and they are boasting, they're bragging of their own spiritual experiences that they have had. And Paul is trying to say, without bragging, no brag, just fact, that he himself has had some amazing spiritual experiences. But he's not quite sure about the nature of those. I mean, it's difficult to describe for him, isn't it? I mean, he talks about himself as though he's talking about another person. I know a man who has had these amazing experiences. Whether it was in the body or out of the body, I don't know. God knows. You can see that he's wrestling with how to capture that. But then he goes on to do something that seems really odd for us who would never think to brag about weakness. And Paul goes on to brag about his weakness and to say that he has received a thorn in his body to keep him from being conceited. It's a difficult thing, whatever it is. We really don't know what it is. We know that it was very painful for Paul because the word that gets translated thorn is the word that's used for a sharpened stake that the Romans used as an implement of torture or in warfare. This is not just a little thorn Paul is talking about. This is something excruciatingly painful, very difficult for Paul. And we wonder, what is it? It's that mystery in this text, not so much the revelations, not so much those spiritual experiences, but the mystery in this text that draws everyone's attention, that every commentator comments on. And even after saying no one knows what the thorn in the body or the thorn in the flesh, as it's often translated, is, they go on to speculate what it might be. Because we're captivated by this notion of a thorn. What was it that tormented Paul so? Was it persecution? Was it opposition within the church? What was it that tormented Paul? Was it spiritual temptation? What tormented the apostle? Was it chronic malarial fever? He's from Tarsus. Tarsus is a low-lying area. Possibly he picked up malaria when he was a youth or a child and had recurring chronic malarial fever over the years. Debilitating, terrible headaches, terrible fever, nausea, and all that goes with that in chronic malaria. Maybe that's what this thorn in his body was. Or maybe it was bad eyesight, some eye problem. Paul writes to the Galatians when he praises them for their hospitality, and by the way, he says that he met them in the first place and had the opportunity to share with them in the first place because of a physical infirmity. Paul then says, you were so good to me, so welcoming to me, that if it had been possible, you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. And he then at the end of that letter takes the pen in hand from the scribe to whom he was dictating the letter to the Galatians, and he says, see with what large letters I write to you in my own hand. So maybe it was an eye problem. We really don't know. But we know that it was a difficult thing for Paul. And we want to know, we're fascinated with the thorns because if you think about it, it's the thorns that really get our attention anyway, isn't it? I mean, if you think about it, what are all the headlines that we read on any given day? They're not roses, they're thorns. Or if you think about it, when we gather and we're discussing what's going on in the world, do we talk mostly about roses or about thorns? It's the thorns that seem to really get our attention, isn't it? Those difficulties in life, those hard places, the thorns. Now, there are roses there, of course, too. It's just that they're always not so obvious. I remember 3 years ago when we were celebrating my mother's 90th birthday, we had her birthday celebration, which also was a family reunion. And in that gathering, we had a huge bouquet of 90 roses to celebrate her birthday. And it was a perfect symbol, really, for the day. 90 years of blessing, 90 years of beauty. It was a symbol for our gathering as we came together after many of us having not seen each other for a long time, catching up, sharing memories and laughing and all that. But each of those roses also had thorns, also a fitting symbol. In each of those years, there were difficult places, of course, as there are in any life. In our gathering, there were people there who came to that gathering in a very difficult place in their lives, chronic illness, or having just lost someone that they loved. There were people who were not present in our gathering who would have been there a year earlier but were no longer with us. So there were thorns there as well. But on that day, the roses took center stage, not the thorns. But there are other times in our lives when that's not true. Isn't that right? I mean, don't you know that there are times when the rose garden turns into a thorn patch? This past Thursday, I'm a member of the Downtown Fort Worth, Inc. Board of Directors, and we have a monthly meeting. And this past Thursday at our meeting, someone gave a report that said that all of the rose bushes in the downtown area had to be pulled up and destroyed. And if you're a gardener, you know why. It's because of a terrible epidemic, a disease of rose bushes that's running rampant through North Texas right now. Rosette disease. I mean, it's happened in all sorts of places, public gardens and private gardens, the Botanic Garden, the Arboretum in Dallas. All over the place, thousands and thousands of rose bushes have been infected with this virus, and the effects are devastating. They literally turn a rose garden into a patch of thorns. The stems of the plants become covered with thorns. Almost no blooms, and what blooms there are are deformed in some way. The leaves are curled and puckered. It's something that turns beauty into ugliness. It's a terrible thing. There are so many stories of people who have watched their beautiful rose gardens become thorn patches. It occurs to me that sometimes that happens to us. Sometimes we're going along, everything seems just fine, and then all of a sudden, the rose garden is a thorn patch. And what a difficult place to be. The Apostle Paul had thorns in his life. Oh, he had this big thorn in his body that he talks about, whatever it was, but he had a lot of other thorns. When Paul talks about his life in his own writings, he describes shipwrecks. He describes being stoned nearly to death, receiving the 39 lashes, being beaten with rods. He was imprisoned. He was exposed to the elements. He almost lost his life on a number of occasions. He was in danger from robbers, in danger from his own people, he writes. Paul had a very thorny life. You all have experienced thorns. I'm pretty sure of it. And if you haven't, you will. And I've seen that in the thorniest places, something else is present. Paul experienced that too. And in our text for today, it says that Paul, he says of himself that he had prayed repeatedly. He says 3 times, but 3 being one of those complete numbers means over and over and over again when it's used that way in Scripture. 3 times, over and over again, he has prayed that the thorn, this stake in his body, would be removed from him. And as far as we know, Paul took that thorn, whatever it was, to his grave. It was never removed. Do you know what that's like? Do you know that experience that Paul also had? But the story really doesn't end there at all, because Paul did receive an answer. In the thorn patch, dealing with this major thorn in his life, whatever it was, Paul received an answer. And that answer was, "My grace is enough for you, for power is made perfect in weakness." My grace is enough for you, for power is made perfect in weakness. See, even in the thorn patch, even in that patch of thorns that it seems like only yesterday was a rose garden, there is something else there, and it is the presence of God. It's the grace of God. And in Paul's writings, you can replace the word grace almost any time with the word power, and it still works. My power is enough for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. You could just as well say. See, for Paul, grace is forgiveness. Grace is mercy. Grace is the unmerited love of God. It's also the strength and the power of God at work, even and perhaps especially in the patches of thorns. This past week I heard about a pastor who suffered from depression. She recounted her experience of being hospitalized in this very dark place in her life. She said that her spiritual director came to the hospital to visit her and brought communion for her, and they looked around the bare room and they didn't see any place where they could set up the elements for communion. Of course, in that room there were no symbols, there were no candles, no crosses. There was no table. And so they took a trash can and they emptied the contents of the trash can out and they turned it over. They turned it upside down. And they used it for a communion table. And they received the elements. And they received, she recounted, in that darkest of places. I would say today, in the thorniest of places, grace. Grace. The good news of our faith is that God's grace is enough. Even, in fact, Paul would say, especially among the thorns. So as we go from this place today, I hope we will go knowing that whatever thorns we face, that God's grace is enough in the midst of them. And that we would go from this place remembering Paul's words, that is, the words he heard in his prayer. God's grace is enough for you. For God's power is made perfect in our weakness. Let's pray. Our gracious God, we hear these words of Paul and we can identify to some extent with his experiences. You know, O God, what thorns there are in this room, in our lives. Help us, O God, to hear again the good news that present among the thorns is your grace, and that it is enough, sufficient for us. In Jesus' name, amen.